Good morning, children. Today we will study from our supplement reader in English, Footprints Without Feet. And from that footprint without feet, we will study today the first chapter, A Triumph of Surgery. Now, this story is about a small dog, Tricky. Now, Tricky has been pampered and overfed by his owner. She is a very rich lady, because of which Tricky has fallen sick. And when his mistress consults the veterinary doctor, what line of treatment the veterinary doctor follows, that is the story that we are going to study today. The name is A Triumph of Surgery. I'll read now. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage, with a leg at each corner. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Now, the veterinary doctor, when he saw Tricky, he was really worried. He was driving a car and he stopped his car. I pulled up my car means he stopped his car. When he saw in the street, Tricky was walking along with his mistress. And he says, when I saw him, I was really shocked. Why? Because Tricky had become hugely fat. In fact, he had become oversized, just like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. Now, we all eat hamburger if you have eaten it. Inside that burger, they put that sausage, which is banana type, which is protruding out on both the sides in that hot dog, and that is what is called a sausage. He had become like a bloated sausage with one part hanging on both the sides. His eyes were bloodshot and rheumy, red with blood, and rheumy means there was a watery discharge coming out from his eyes, and he stared straight ahead, and his tongue used to hang from his mouth towards his down to from his jaws, always the tongue hanging out. That is how fat he had become. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Harriet. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up, some malt and cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much, really. Now, when Mrs. Pumphrey saw that the veterinary doctor had stepped out of his car on seeing at them, she hastened to explain to him. Now, what did she explain to him? She told Mr. Harriet, the veterinary doctor, she said that he was looking so listless. He was not feeling well, according to her. Seemed to have no energy at all. So she thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. Now just think, the dog is like a bloated sausage. He has been compared with an oversized bloated sausage. He is already very fat. He can hardly walk. And the lady, she has pampered the dog so much that she thinks that the dog must be having no energy and is suffering from malnutrition. Now, if you are suffering from malnutrition, normally you will be looking like a skeleton, your body structure, except for the stomach, which is protruding out in malnutrition. Otherwise, only bones will be visible of your body. This dog is totally opposite. In spite of it, the lady is thinking that he is suffering from malnutrition. So she said, I have been giving him a little bit extra food between meals. And what was that little extra which she was giving? Malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night so that he can sleep. That is nothing much really. This is what is according to her, nothing much. Already she has been feeding him, plus what is written over here, cod liver oil, malt, and a bowl of Horlicks, that is extra between meals which she is giving her, and according to her it is nothing much. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? And the doctor asked, have you cut down on the sweet things? Because she used to give him sweets to eat also. And the doctor said, have you stopped giving him sweets? Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak. I had to relent. He does love cream cakes and chocolate, so I can't bear to refuse him. She says, yes, for a short period of time, I had stopped giving him sweets. But then he looked so weak that I had to relent. When she gave up on not giving him, she started to give him again because she told that he loves his cream cakes and chocolate so much that I can't bear to refuse him not to give. So I started again. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night, and I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. The doctor looked at the little dog and he realized that this little dog's only fault was that he was greedy. Whatever time of the day he was offered meal or food, he never refused. He was greedy. Whenever he was given food, he would eat. He would tackle the meal any hour of the day or night. And then the doctor is wondering all the things that Mrs. Pumphrey had mentioned. What not this dog would be given to eat. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Well, he has little walks with me, as you can see. But Hodgkin the gardener has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately. Then the doctor asked again, are you giving him plenty of exercises? He says, yes, regularly I take him down for little walks, as you can see. But Hodgkin, who is their gardener, he has been down with lumbago. Lumbago is a muscular pain in the back. Of late he has been having that pain, so there has been no ring throwing in the garden of late. I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right now and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I am sure you are right. But it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down, along the road as a detriment to put the new regime into the practice immediately. Now the doctor tried to sound strict with the lady. He says, now I mean this. If you don't cut out on the food and give him more exercise, he is going to be very sick. Remember this thing very well. Stop giving him food and start his exercises. And then he told, you must harden your heart, Mrs. Pumphrey's, and you have to keep him on a very strict diet. This is Mrs. Pumphrey's problem. She is overfeeding the dog and she can't see him remain hungry, and the doctor has told to put him on a strict diet and lots of exercise. Well, she wrung her hands. She said, oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I am sure you are right. She also understands what the doctor is telling is the truth. But then she says, it is very difficult for me. So very difficult. She went along the road with her head down, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. What the doctor had told, to cut down on the food and start exercising. Put the dog on a strict diet. That is the new regime which the doctor had told. And she went away as if she is determined to do all these things. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. Now, as they were going along the road, the doctor watched them move ahead. Tricky was tottering. Tottering means a person who can hardly walk. You will think as if it will fall down. That way the dog was walking in his little tweed coat. There, the dog is in the coat, as you can see in the picture. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats. Since his owner is very rich, the dog is regularly being given clothes to wear, and he has a whole cupboard full of such type of coats for cold weather, as well as a raincoat for the wet days. The dog struggled walking along, drooping in his harness. He was bending down. He could not stand straight and walk, the harness to which it was tied. And the doctor, this thought came to his mind that it wouldn't be long before again Mrs. Pumphrey's called him. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all time lying on a rug, panting, didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. Now the doctor was expecting Mrs. Pumphrey to call him again, and within a few days she called back. She was distraught. She was full of sadness when she called him. She told the doctor Tricky would eat nothing. He even is refusing to eat his favorite dishes. And besides, he is having bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time just lying on a rug, panting. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. That means now the dog is really sick and is lying on one place. Otherwise, dogs are very playful, we all know. But if it keeps lying in one place and panting is breathing heavily, you understand that the dog is not well, not wanting to do anything, not going for walks or nothing. I had made my plans in advance. The only way to get Tricky out of the house for a period, I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. The poor lady almost swooned. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. The doctor beforehand only had decided what he had to do, what line of treatment he had to take for the dog. The only way that he could get the dog out of Mrs. Pumphrey's house for a long period of time was that he suggested that the dog has to be hospitalized for a fortnight. 15 days the dog has to be kept because I need to keep him under observation. That was the only way he could take the dog out of the house of Mrs. Pumphrey and treat him properly. As soon as Mrs. Pumphrey heard that he needs to be kept for observation for 15 days, she almost swooned. Swooned means she almost became unconscious. And she was sure that the dog would pine is to long for, and die if he did not see her every day. This is what she thinks, that the dog would die if she does not see him every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. And the doctor was firmly determined. He knew that the dog was very sick and the only way to save him was taking him away. And he thought, without delay I will do it now itself. And he took the dog along with him wrapped in a blanket and marched out towards his car. Mrs. Pumphrey had already started crying when he took the dog out. The entire staff was roused and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. The entire staff was roused. Was roused means was put into action. Maids of the house, they started rushing in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, his favorite cushions, his toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Very quickly the doctor realized that the amount of things these people are going to put in my car, all these things will not be able to hold in his car. So he moved off, and Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of little coat through the window inside the doctor's car. And before turning round the corner, the doctor looked in the mirror, and what did he notice? Mrs. Pumphrey, along with all the staff members, were in tears. They were crying because the doctor had taken the dog away. But it was for the good of the dog. So he had taken away. But that was the attachment of Mrs. Pumphrey with the dog, that she, along with her whole staff, was crying when the doctor took the dog away for treatment. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said. You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Out on the road, when only the dog and the doctor are inside the car, the doctor looked down towards the dog and patted him on his head. The dog made a brave effort just to wag his tail. And whenever you pat a dog, it will normally wag its tail. That is the love which it shows towards you by wagging its tail and showing its happiness. The dog made a brave effort just to wag his tail. And the doctor said, poor old lad, you haven't a kick in you. Means you don't have any kind of energy in you, poor old boy. But I think I know what is the cure for you. At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. And when he reached home at the surgery, that is his hospital, there are other dogs also, the household dogs. Many of them were there. They all stood around them. Tricky looked down at all these dogs were making lots of noise with dull eyes when he was put down. But he lay motionless on the carpet. He did not move from there. The other dogs, they came near him, sniffed him for a few seconds, and they decided that this dog is an uninteresting object, and they ignored him. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third day he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. The doctor made a bed for him along with all the other dogs in a warm, loose box. Then, for 2 days, the doctor just observed the dog, gave him no food to eat. He was only given plenty of water. By the end of the second day, the dog started to show some kind of interest in his surroundings. And on the third day, he even started to whimper. Whimper is that noise which dogs make when they hear the other dogs making any kind of noise. When all the other dogs in the yards, they were enjoying their mischief by running around and making noise, he also started to make a little bit of noise listening to those dogs. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe the greyhound and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. When he opened the door, Tricky trotted out. Still he can't walk properly. It looks as if he may fall the way he is walking. And as he opened the door, immediately all the dogs engulfed him, surrounded him. First was Joe. His breed is the greyhound. And then his friends. They all came over and they rolled him over and thoroughly inspected him. Then the dogs moved down the garden. Tricky also followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. He followed them. He is extra fat. He has surplus amount of fat around his body, but still he continued following them. Later that day I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush, followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. Later that day, the doctor remained present even at the meal time. And he is watching Tristan, one of the staff members in the hospital, as he filled up the food bowls. As soon as the dogs were told to eat, normally dogs eat very fast. Headlong they rush into the bowl, and that sound of high speed eating. And every dog knew that they had to eat very fast. Why? Because if any dog ate slowly, and the other dogs, as soon as they would finish their meals, they would join that dog, and he would have unnecessary competition to finish the last part of his meal, which was supposed to be its own meal, but the other dogs would follow and join him. So all dogs used to finish their food together most of the time by eating at a very high speed. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely silky object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. Now when these dogs finished eating, Tricky took a walk around. Tricky is not given food still. So the doctor just let him walk around those bowls. In one or two bowls he licked. Nothing more. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him also. For 2 days he did not feed him. The third day he was going to be given food. And the doctor says, I was very happy to see him jostling his way towards it. From then on, the progress of the dog was rapid. The doctor gave him no medicinal treatment of any kind. All day he used to run around with the other dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. Scrimmages means to get together in a very rough manner, pushing and shoving one another. That is how you meet, that is how dogs meet normally, and that are called scrimmages. He discovered the happiness of being bowled over, tramped on, squashed every few minutes. The scrimmages used to happen every few minutes, and they used to roll him over, trample on him, squash him. Every few minutes this would happen with Tricky, but he enjoyed it all the time. And he became an accepted member of the gang. But he was an unlikely member of the gang. Why? Because he was silky smooth among all the shaggy crew. And it looked like he was the odd man out, because all others were rough and tough dogs, and Tricky was a delicate darling over there, silky smooth. But and when there was time to eat, their meal times, he would fight for his share just like a tiger, not allowing others to touch his food, and used to hunt rats in the old hen house at night. And perhaps this was the best time that Tricky was having in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather. But I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. Mrs. Pumphrey is the neighbor of our veterinary doctor, Mr. Harriet. So all the while, she used to walk around anxiously in the background of her house, peeping over to see, ringing in fact a dozen times a day for the latest update on her dog. The doctor normally avoided questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or he was giving him the correct coat to be worn according to the weather. But he was able to tell her one thing, that the dog was out of danger and he was convalescing rapidly, means recovering from his sickness rapidly. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. Now the doctor said that the dog is convalescing, is recovering. Now that word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey, and she started to bring around fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, just to build up Tricky's strength. So for those many days that the dog was there, and from the day Mrs. Tricky started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, the full staff of the doctor was having a happy period. Why? Because everybody was now having 2 eggs for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. And the household members were surprised that Mrs. Pumphrey is giving even wine to the dog, sending it to them. Now the real possibilities dawned on them that we are going to have the time of our life till this dog is over here. Every day in breakfast they would eat 2 eggs, and at lunchtime this wine was specially sent so that Tricky's blood be enriched. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion, as if every day was a ceremony. The lunch which they ate at home. Why? Because they used to drink 2 wine glasses before lunch and several during the meal. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drank. They were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was waiting collection. First came the eggs, then came wine, and the last thing which they were not at all expecting was brandy, that is liquor. They hardly believed it when brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drank. Now for a few nights everybody in the staff members, they all smelled it, drank it. Spirit, this is what it is called, liquor made of fine spirits, and they drank it respectfully, reverently, after inhaling it, rolling around. Everybody was enjoying, and the doctor says these were days of deep happiness, starting well with the extra egg early in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. Now all these things they were enjoying because of the dog. So the doctor was tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest if he keeps on getting all these luxury items which normally they were not using. But then he also knew that Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight he felt compelled to phone her and tell her that her little dog had recovered and he was awaiting collection. Within minutes, a long car, black in color, 30 feet long, drew up outside the hospital. The chauffeur opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Mrs. Pumphrey did not drive herself the car. It was a chauffeur driven car. Chauffeur means a driver. Only the rich can afford all these luxuries. Car was being driven by a chauffeur, and he opened the door and the doctor could see Mrs. Pumphrey inside the car, almost lost. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he better?" "Yes, he is fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I will go and fetch him straight away," After all, she is worried about her dog. So she asked, "Oh, please tell me, Mr. Harriet, is he fine?" He says, "Yes, nothing to worry, and please don't get out of the car. I will go and bring him." I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in the midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. He walked through the house in the garden, that mass of dogs hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their middle, with ears flapping, tails waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe. Lithe is flexible and hard muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack. Means now he was able to run with the pack. He was not lagging behind or tottering. He could run with their same speed which all the dogs were running around, stretching out in great bounds, and his chest was now almost brushing the ground when he used to stretch. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "oh" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. Now, when he brought the dog along the passage to the front of the house, the driver is still holding the door car open. And when Tricky saw his mistress, he just took off from the arms of the doctor and with a tremendous jump sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She was surprised. She gave a surprising "oh" and then she had to defend herself as he swarmed over her. That is how dogs show love. When you are having a pet dog at your home and you don't meet the dog for, say, suppose 5-6 days or even more than that, as soon as you come back home, the dog will swarm all over you. They start licking your face. That is how they show their love, embracing you all the time. For a few moments, the dog won't allow you to do anything other than what it wants to do with you. That is its way of showing love. And started to bark, started to lick her face, swarmed all over her. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coat, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes, her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." Now, while the dog was showering its love on Mrs. Pumphrey, the doctor helped the chauffeur put in all the things which he had brought when he brought the dog to his hospital. His beds, his toys, his cushions, his coats, his bowls, the doctor had used none of them. It was just lying like that from the day they were brought. And when the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey just leaned out of the window. Her eyes were teary. This time those tears were of happiness, and her lips trembled, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Harriet, how can I ever thank you? This is really a victory of surgery." She thought that the doctor might have performed some kind of operation on the dog, but it was nothing like that. He just had decided what kind of treatment he should give the dog, and accordingly he treated the dog and made him recover from his sickness. This is the story.